An ordinary man vanishes without a trace, and 5 days later, his body is found lying on top of a coal pile, as if it had been placed there from the sky. But the real question is what happened to Zigmund Adamski during those missing days. It was the summer of 1980, and in the quiet mining town of Todmorden in West Yorkshire, life moved with a familiar rhythm, the sound of coal wagons, the chatter of neighbors, the hum of a community where everyone knew everyone else. Among them was a man named Zigmund Adamski, 56 years old, originally from Poland but settled in England for decades, known as a quiet, hard-working figure who loved his wife Lottie dearly. He was the kind of man you would see at the shop or passing on the street and never imagine his name would one day be spoken in whispers of mystery. On the afternoon of June 6, 1980, Zigmund left his modest home in Tingley, near Wakefield, telling his wife he would only be gone for a short while, a simple errand to the local shops. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But hours passed, and the evening fell silent without his return. At first, concern was mixed with patience. Perhaps he had met a friend, perhaps he had been delayed. But as darkness settled and he remained absent, anxiety grew, and soon Lottie, confined by illness, alerted neighbors and authorities. The police opened a missing persons case, and searches began almost immediately. Friends, family, and officers canvassed the streets, knocked on doors, asked shopkeepers, walked the nearby lanes and open fields. Some people recalled seeing him earlier that day, walking as usual, but no one had seen him after mid-afternoon. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. His disappearance puzzled everyone who knew him. He was a man of routine, devoted to his wife, without enemies, debts, or reasons to abandon his life. The police scoured hospitals and shelters, interviewed anyone who might have had a connection to him, but they found nothing. Days dragged on, 5 long days. For his family, they were days of dread and despair, each hour stretching into hopelessness, until on June 11th, the mystery took a horrifying turn. At a coal yard in Todmorden, some 20 miles from his home, a worker named Trevor Parker was finishing his shift. He noticed something strange on top of a large coal pile. At first glance, it looked like a bundle of discarded sacks. As he drew nearer, however, the shape resolved into the unmistakable form of a human body. Shocked, he realized he was looking at the corpse of a man lying atop the jagged mound. The police were called, and among the first responders was P.C. Alan Godfrey, who would later become notorious for his own strange encounter. The scene that greeted them was both bizarre and chilling. The body was identified as none other than the missing man, Zigmund Adamski. But the way he was found defied explanation. The coal pile was steep, its surface unstable, and yet Adamski's body was positioned almost neatly on top, as if it had been placed there with care. There were no footprints leading up, no drag marks, no sign of struggle or disturbance in the surrounding area. His clothes are those he had worn on the day he vanished, but they appeared odd, his shirt buttoned incorrectly, his shoes loosely tied, as though someone unfamiliar with human clothing had dressed him. Yet despite lying on a coal heap, his clothes bore surprisingly little coal dust. His watch and wallet were missing, though there was no evidence of robbery. Most haunting of all was his face. His features were frozen in an expression of pure terror, his wide eyes bulging, his mouth slightly open, as though in his final moments he had seen something unspeakable. Medical examiners were unsettled by the sight, some remarking it looked like the face of a man who had died in absolute fright. Then came another disturbing discovery: strange burn-like marks across his neck and shoulders. These injuries appeared fresh, inflicted perhaps only hours before his death. But what baffled doctors most was the substance smeared on the wounds, an ointment, thick and unfamiliar, that did not match any known medication or treatment available at the time. Samples were taken and analyzed, but its composition remained a mystery, a compound no toxicologist or pathologist could identify. During the autopsy, pathologist Dr. Alan Edwards reported that Adamski had died from heart failure, his heart simply giving out. Yet this explanation failed to account for the strangeness surrounding his death. Adamski had been healthy, his heart strong enough for a man his age, and the burns, the ointment, the condition of his body, all these details refused to align with a natural explanation. Moreover, analysis suggested he had been alive until just hours before his body was found, which meant that for nearly 5 days after his disappearance, he had been somewhere, alive, captive, hidden from everyone, and whatever he experienced during that time had led to his final moments of terror. The police investigation quickly ran into dead ends. There were no witnesses, no evidence of where he had been held, no motive for anyone to harm him. He had no enemies, no double life, nothing in his past to suggest criminal entanglements. His wife insisted he would never abandon her, never walk away, and her conviction struck the investigators deeply. How then had he ended up dead, atop a coal pile, marked with strange burns and dressed in disheveled clothing? Officially, the case was left open but unexplained. Quietly, however, officers admitted they had no answers. Some whispered among themselves that the case felt unnatural, as though it belonged to forces beyond their understanding. Rumors spread in Todmorden, a town already known for strange happenings. People began to talk of abductions, of secret experiments, of something beyond the human hand. For the coal worker who found him, for the policeman who stood over his body, and for the widow who never received closure, the image of Zigmund Adamski lying atop that black mountain of coal was something they could never forget. In the pubs and kitchens of Yorkshire, his name became a cautionary tale, a mystery passed down in low voices. Here was an ordinary man, one of their own, who walked out of his house to run a simple errand, and 5 days later was returned as a riddle, his body scarred and his face twisted in fear. And as the coffin was lowered into the earth, and the official record closed with more questions than answers, one chilling thought lingered in every heart. Where had he been during those missing 5 days, and what had he seen that left him frozen forever in terror? In the days that followed the discovery of Zigmund Adamski's lifeless body, the quiet mining town of Todmorden was thrust into an unrelenting storm of speculation, confusion, and a kind of fearful curiosity that seemed to ripple through every street and every household. For although the coal miner's remains had been quickly removed and officially processed by authorities, the manner in which he was found lingered like a malignant whisper on the edge of everyone's consciousness, and people began to wonder not only what had killed Adamski, but also why the circumstances of his demise seemed so eerily beyond comprehension. The police, bound by duty and procedure, attempted to treat the incident as an ordinary death at first glance, but the longer they examined the scant details, the missing days unaccounted for, the pristine condition of his clothes despite lying atop a dirty coal heap, the bizarre burn-like marks that covered parts of his body, and most disturbingly, the strange ointment, like substance that had been smeared over his injuries, the more their confidence fractured, until even veteran officers whispered among themselves that they were facing something unprecedented. Meanwhile, the press seized upon the story with voracious appetite, publishing headlines that painted Adamski's end as anything from a tragic accident to a macabre mystery. And the contrast between official statements that cautiously withheld judgment and the fevered imagination of the public created a gulf that no amount of explanation could bridge, with some locals openly suggesting foul play, while others muttered in hushed tones about supernatural or extraterrestrial interference. Investigators traced Adamski's final movements, noting that he had set out on a seemingly ordinary errand, only to vanish as though swallowed by the earth itself, leaving behind no clues, no witnesses, no explanation. And when his body surfaced nearly a week later in that haunting tableau upon the coal pile, the absence of dirt on his shoes or coal dust on his clothing suggested that he had not climbed there himself, but rather had been placed deliberately, perhaps even dropped from above, a theory so outlandish that it bordered on the absurd. Yet it was the only scenario that accounted for the pristine strangeness of his final resting place. Police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing residents and workers. Yet no one had seen Adamski during his disappearance, and no one reported suspicious activity near the coal yard on the night his body appeared, leaving investigators to wrestle with the impossible timeline and the gnawing suspicion that critical hours and days had transpired in secrecy, hidden from their grasp. As weeks turned into months, the case grew colder, but the aura of dread around it only deepened, with villagers recalling strange lights in the sky, odd humming, noises in the hills, and unexplainable power failures in the region during the exact period of Adamski's disappearance. Reports that the authorities quietly filed away as irrelevant, yet which continued to stir unease among those who already believed the tragedy was not of this earth. And so, Todmorden became a place where whispers replaced answers, where a coal miner's death became a riddle carved into the very fabric of the community, and where police files grew thick with unanswered questions. While the people themselves walked their streets at night with a nervous glance over their shoulders, as though expecting that whatever had taken Zigmund Adamski might one day return for another. As the months passed, and the shock of Zigmund Adamski's inexplicable death began to settle uneasily into the fabric of everyday life in Todmorden, a new chapter unfolded that only deepened the mystery and dragged it into even stranger territory. For among the officers who had handled the case was a young constable named Alan Godfrey, an honest, hard-working man who had walked the coal yard on that fateful day and could never quite erase from his mind the sight of Adamski's lifeless form, his skin oddly marked, his body lying so peculiarly arranged as if some unseen hand had staged the scene with a grim sense of purpose. Godfrey would later admit that even as he jotted down notes and followed procedure, a gnawing unease coiled in the pit of his stomach, a sense that something unnatural had transpired, though he had neither evidence nor vocabulary to name it. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with him, because one cold November night in 1980, barely months after Adamski's body was discovered, Godfrey himself experienced an encounter that would change his life forever and entangle him irrevocably in the same shadow that had swallowed Adamski. While on routine patrol near Burnley Road, he spotted what at first appeared to be a stranded bus ahead on the road, its shape illuminated in the darkness. But as he drew closer, the object revealed itself to be no vehicle of earthly design. It was diamond-shaped, metallic, hovering just above the ground with a slow, silent rotation, its surface glowing faintly as though lit from within, and the strangeness of it rooted him to the spot, his heart hammering in his chest as training battled with disbelief. Later, under hypnosis, Godfrey would recall details that chilled those who heard them, being pulled from his patrol car, finding himself in a sterile, otherworldly chamber where tall, humanoid beings with black, piercing eyes studied him with detached curiosity, and then waking back his car with 30 minutes unaccounted for, the diamond-shaped craft gone, leaving only tire marks scorched across the wet road as proof that something solid had been there. Though he initially tried to rationalize the experience, the timing of it in such close proximity to Adamski's mysterious death was impossible for him to ignore, and whispers soon spread through the force and the community that perhaps Godfrey had glimpsed the same forces that had claimed the coal miner, a suggestion that many dismissed with nervous laughter, but which nonetheless lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Skeptics, journalists, and even fellow officers ridiculed Godfrey, painting him as either delusional or attention-seeking, yet those who knew him best swore that he was neither liar nor fool, and his shaken demeanor, his refusal to exploit the story for profit, and his haunted eyes convinced many that he had truly seen something beyond human comprehension. Thus, Adamski's death and Godfrey's encounter became threads of the same tapestry of fear, binding Todmorden to a legend of lights in the sky, abductions, and unearthly interference. And as the townspeople spoke of these events in hushed tones, some wondered if the coal miner had been taken, experimented upon, and then returned broken, his body discarded in plain sight as a warning or perhaps as a careless afterthought, while others whispered that the same unseen intelligence that watched Godfrey in the night had orchestrated the miner's death from beginning to end, a theory that lent to the story a terrifying suggestion that the strange fate of Zigmund Adamski was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, hidden pattern in which human beings were but pawns in a game played by something vast, cold, and far beyond their control. In the years that followed, the strange death of Zigmund Adamski refused to fade into the dusty archives of forgotten cases, for every attempt at closure only deepened the wound, and every explanation collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a town haunted by the lingering echo of something it could not name. The official report spoke only of heart failure, a medical shrug that satisfied no one, while the odd details, the neatly applied ointment unknown to any doctor, the lack of coal dust on the miner's clothes, the bizarre burn-like marks on his head and neck, remained an unsettling puzzle that no authority dared pursue too loudly, for to do so would invite ridicule or worse, the possibility of confronting truths that lay outside the comfortable walls of human understanding. In the pubs and kitchens of West Yorkshire, whispers grew louder, stories exchanged over pints, and hushed voices about Adamski's abduction, about lights seen in the night sky, about men in dark suits who warned locals to forget what they'd seen. And those skeptics scoffed, and newspapers moved on to fresher scandals. Those who had stood close to the body, who had seen the raw, unexplainable details with their own eyes, carried the memory like a private curse. Constable Alan Godfrey, forever scarred by his own encounter, became a reluctant symbol of the mystery, a man both respected and ridiculed, a police officer whose oath to truth had led him into a labyrinth of shadows where the ordinary laws of evidence no longer applied, and though he tried to live an ordinary life, the story of Adamski trailed him like a ghost he could never outrun. Families of the town, still recalling how the miner vanished for 5 days, only to be found discarded on a coal pile in a position that seemed almost ritualistic, began to lock their doors earlier at night, some muttering prayers, others staring at the stars with silent suspicion, wondering if the same fate could befall them or their loved ones. And so the legacy of Zigmund Adamski's death became more than a cold case. It became a warning, a riddle carved into the collective memory of a community that could never decide whether it had brushed against a crime of human cruelty or something far stranger, something not of this earth. And perhaps that uncertainty was the most terrifying truth of all, because while a murder or conspiracy could at least be hunted, punished, and contained, the possibility that Adamski was taken by forces beyond human reach meant there was no justice to seek, no closure to be found, only the quiet knowledge that in the darkness above, or in the hidden corners of the world, something waited and watched, indifferent to human suffering, powerful enough to pluck a man from his life and return him lifeless, marked and broken, leaving behind nothing but silence, fear, and a story that even today refuses to die.